think of mental illness, what are the stereotypes you think of? Mental health and mental illness is a topic that's been gaining a lot of attention recently in media. Some people are confused as to why. A lot of people think that mental illness is not a huge issue. However, we can see from research that this is not the case. In fact, 1 in 5 adults will struggle with mental illness at some point during their life. And we can see from other research that stigma, those negative stereotypes surrounding mental illness, are something that is predictive of if someone is going to seek treatment or not. So why am I so interested in this? This is a topic that I've been covering in all of my speeches for this semester. This is something that I personally do a lot of research in. I think that mental health and mental illness are a very important topic. I am a psychology major, so this is something that I personally find a lot of interest in. So I have done a lot of research outside of these speeches, looking into what stigma perpetuates mental illness and how that can be helped. To start, I'd like to tell you about Michelle. Michelle grew up hearing the taboo and the stigma around mental illness. She attributes this in part to the fact that she was raised in an Asian American household, stating that the cultural beliefs that were in her household while growing up were against mental illness and perpetuated the stereotype that mental illness is something negative and something to be ashamed about. When Michelle started struggling with depression when she was in high school, she worried about talking to her family or any of those around her because she did not want to become a burden. She also did not know any mental health coping skills, and this in part led to the continued decline of her mental health. Michelle was not diagnosed with major depressive disorder until she was a sophomore in college. At this point, she had been struggling for many, many years. She only sought treatment because she became worried that she would be unable to complete her medical school program and that she would be unable to find a counselor that she connected with. A lot of people are unaware of the actual number of individuals that are struggling with mental illness. A lot of people are also raised in households similar to Michelle's, where the stigma and taboo about mental illness are perpetuated and put into our belief systems at a young age. This can lead to a lot of struggle when asking for help. As we saw, Michelle struggled to look for help because she was worried she would become a burden. But if she wasn't worried about becoming a burden, which was that worry was caused by the stigma around mental health, what would have happened if she had been able to get treatment at an early age, when she was in high school and first began struggling? So the first thing I want to do is look at how the perpetuation of stigma is harmful. So research has shown that a lack of education about mental health in general leads to the perpetuation of these negative stereotypes and the stigma. So we can see that education is very important. In one study that looked at mental health programs in schools, they found that the application of these programs led to a reduced number of barriers for the individuals seeking treatment. So we know that stigma causes these barriers and causes people to be worried about how others will see them if they seek treatment. But education reduces this stigma. Therefore, it reduces the number of barriers that people struggle with. Education is very important when it comes to stopping the perpetuation of stigma. But why? Why is this important? What problems are being caused by stigma that we need to get rid of stigma? Stigma actually has been shown to lead to higher rates of people not seeking treatment. In a study that was done on college-aged individuals, the more stigma that someone had taken and believed, the more likely they were to not seek treatment. So we know that stigma causes shame. It causes these barriers that make people not want to seek treatment. And there's no formal education against stigma, so we don't have anything in place that is proven to stop this stigma that's causing these problems. The only thing we do have in recent years, as this has become a bigger topic in media, is applications for cell phones and computers. The issue with these is that even though they are educating and providing treatment for those that are worried about the stigma of seeking treatment in person, They're using treatment that is not evidence-based, which means that at the end of the day, they are causing more issues than they are resolving. So the education that we do have is lax and partially incorrect. So what are the negatives of untreated mental illness? If we know that education can stop stigma, and that stigma is bad and causes these mental illnesses and the perpetuation of them, what are the negative and harmful outcomes of continuing to perpetuate the stigma and not treating mental illness? The biggest area that I think is important to look at here is our school-aged individuals. In a recent study, over 50% of surveyed individuals aged 11 to 17 reported having recent and reoccurring thoughts of self-harm or suicide. So we can see that this young generation of children are struggling with mental illness and have no resources on how to manage that themselves, how to cope healthily, or how to seek treatment without worrying about stigma. And one of the biggest issues that we can see with this is that untreated mental illness leads to higher rates of dropout. That means that this large population of our younger children are going untreated and potentially not being able to succeed in their schooling because of mental illness. So we can see that there's a higher population at risk of dropout because of this lack of education due to stigma. So we can see that stigma is a big issue when it comes to mental health. It's perpetuating negative stereotypes, making people worry about seeking treatment, and leaving untreated mental illness to continue to have harmful effects. But some people think that education won't be helpful. And even more than that, some people think that mental illness is not a big issue, not something that we need to worry about. So the biggest issue with this is that education has proven successful. In 2018, a study was done that actually found that education does lead to lower rates of believed stigma. Teaching the signs of mental illness is an important part of reducing that stigma so that our youth can get treatment without worrying about what others will think of them or the other stigmas of being a burden that are around mental health. Now, the other issue here is the people that believe that mental illness is not that big of a deal. As I've stated before, a lot of people are unaware that 1/5 of adults will struggle with mental illness at some point in their life. And we know that mental illness has a negative impact. As I've said before, there's an understanding that having a mental illness makes it so that students are unable to thrive fully in a school environment, leading to higher rates of dropout. This is very, very harmful if it's left untreated. It's important to educate, to reduce that stigma, to take down those barriers that are making people worried about seeking help for their mental illness. It's time for us to educate, reduce stigma, and fight mental illness at the core. Today I've presented you with 3 arguments for the education against stigma. 1, the lack of education leads to a perpetuation of negative and harmful stigma. 2, stigma leads to people not seeking treatment, and this leads to higher rates of untreated mental illness. And finally, untreated mental illness does have very harmful outcomes. The information that I've given you of breaking the stigma tells us that education is very helpful in reducing stigma, and that mental illness is a big issue that we need to be talking about. So what can we do? As people that are not necessarily working directly in a mental health field, what is it that we can do by ourselves to stop that stigma? The first thing that we can do is look at the language we're using. It's important to understand that the perpetuation of stigma comes from us perpetuating it through the way that we are communicating with others. So if you find yourself using language that continues to perpetuate these negative stereotypes, recognize it and stop. The other thing you can do is recognize it in those around you and educate them on why it's harmful to continue. And lastly, it's knowing what you know now about mental illness, you can start educating those around you. It's not too late to start educating yourself and those around you about mental illness. It's time for us to break the stigma surrounding mental illness. Okay. Note card 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Thank you for listening.